the fall of 1974, Millhaven was the kind of American town where nothing ever seemed to change. A cluster of quiet streets, a handful of diners, a hardware store, and the red brick high school that stood like a monument at the edge of Main Street. Parents felt safe letting their children walk to class. Teachers lived modest lives, and gossip revolved around football games and church picnics. But every small town hides secrets. And in Millhaven, one of those secrets was about to take shape in the most unsettling way possible. Among the faculty at Millhaven High was Mr. Richard Coleman, a 42-year-old history teacher. Students knew him for his strict posture and horn-rimmed glasses, always polished, always fixed just above the bridge of his nose. He wasn't warm, but he wasn't cruel either. He demanded discipline, but rewarded effort. To many kids, Coleman was the teacher who forced you to work harder. But years later, you'd remember him as the one who pushed you to succeed. He lived alone in a modest second-floor apartment, a short walk from the school. Every morning, neighbors saw him walking down Willow Street with the same leather briefcase tucked under his arm. He had no wife, no children, no known family nearby. His life was predictable: work, books, an occasional meal at the local diner. Ordinary, forgettable, safe. But on one October afternoon in 1974, that routine ended forever. Monday, October 14th, started like any other. Coleman lectured on the Reconstruction era, his chalk squeaking across the blackboard as students scribbled notes. A few classmates later recalled he seemed distracted, pausing, staring at the board longer than usual, almost as if his mind was elsewhere. Still, nothing seemed alarming. When the dismissal bell rang, he walked the hallway carrying his briefcase, nodding to the janitor, and stepped into his assigned classroom. Room 2B. The janitor would later swear he saw Coleman switch on the light, close the door, and remain inside. That was the last time anyone in Millhaven saw Mr. Coleman alive. The next morning, when Coleman didn't show up for class, colleagues assumed he was sick. By midweek, rumors spread that he had taken a sudden leave. But then came the discovery that made the story far stranger. His apartment appeared untouched, bed neatly made, wallet and car keys on the nightstand, no bags packed, no notes left behind. His car was still parked outside the school. The only thing missing was him. Police questioned teachers, janitors, students. No one had seen him leave. There were no reports of arguments, no sign of forced entry. In his desk drawer sat neatly stacked essays, waiting to be graded. His coffee mug still smelled faintly of black coffee. It was as if he had stepped out of the classroom and vanished into thin air. Millhaven buzzed with speculation. Some whispered that Coleman had been overwhelmed by loneliness and simply left town. Others believed he had fallen in love with a fellow teacher and run away in secret. Darker rumors suggested a student might have attacked him after class. But none of these theories explained the locked car, the untouched apartment, or why a man so set in his routines would vanish without even cashing his next paycheck. By winter, police quietly closed the investigation. No evidence, no witnesses, no body. It was written off as a disappearance, filed away as another cold case. Over time, the story of Mr. Coleman became less about facts and more about whispers. Students in room 2B joked nervously about his ghost still grading papers at night. Janitors swore they heard chalk scratching across the board long after school hours. Parents told their kids not to linger in the halls after dark. But behind the legends was a real family, a real man, and a community left without answers. For nearly 30 years, generations of Millhaven students sat in that very classroom, never knowing that the truth, the body of their missing teacher, had been there all along, sealed behind a wall of plaster and silence. The disappearance of Richard Coleman lingered in Millhaven like a shadow no one could shake. At first there was urgency. Police combed through the school for hours, bringing in dogs, searching every classroom, every hallway, even the boiler room. They spread out into the nearby woods, convinced that if Coleman had collapsed or wandered off, he would be found within hours. But there was nothing. No broken branches, no discarded belongings, no signs of a struggle. Days turned to weeks. The investigation slowed. Millhaven's small police force had never dealt with a case that offered so few answers. Detectives interviewed dozens of students, teachers, and staff. Some remembered Coleman leaving the classroom late in the afternoon, but no one saw him walk out of the building. Others swore they saw his silhouette through the frosted glass of room 2B's door well into the evening, as if he were still grading papers. But when the janitor unlocked the room later that night, it was empty. His car remained parked outside the school, locked. His apartment appeared frozen in time. A pot of coffee sat half full on the counter. His bed was made. His glasses case and spare clothes were neatly folded. Nothing was missing. Investigators even checked his bank account. No withdrawals, no unusual transactions. It was as if the man had been erased. By December 1974, the case had grown cold. Police quietly filed Coleman under missing person. Without evidence of foul play, they could go no further. And so, Millhaven was left with rumors instead of answers. Over the years, those rumors hardened into stories. In the late 70s, students whispered about the ghost of room 2B. Some swore they heard chalk scratching across the blackboard at night. Others claimed to see faint writing appear on the board when no one was in the room. Teachers dismissed the tales as childish exaggerations, but janitors spoke in low voices about the strange sounds they heard after dark. Footsteps in an empty hallway, the creak of a door opening when no one was there. For parents, the disappearance of a teacher inside the very school their children attended was a chilling reminder that safety was never guaranteed. Some urged the school board to shut down room 2B entirely. Instead, the administration quietly painted the walls, replaced the desks, and tried to move forward. Students kept learning in the same classroom year after year, with no idea of the secret hidden just behind the plaster. By the 1980s, Coleman's name became a local myth. High school seniors told freshmen the story of the teacher who walked into his classroom and never came out. It was passed down like folklore, a ghost story that gave the town its own chilling identity. Some joked about it at sleepovers. Others took it seriously, refusing to walk alone past room 2B after dark. For the few teachers who had worked alongside him, the story was anything but entertainment. They remembered a man who lived a quiet, predictable life. A man who showed up to work every day until the day he vanished. Retired colleagues often admitted that whenever they thought of Coleman, they felt an ache of unfinished business. One said, "You don't just lose someone inside a school. That's not supposed to happen. Buildings don't eat people." Detectives revisited the case a few times. In 1983, a new officer pulled the file from storage, hoping fresh eyes might spot something missed. He walked the halls of Millhaven High, questioning staff who barely remembered the details. After weeks of work, he closed it again. In 1992, the same happened. Coleman's file was reopened, then quietly returned to the cabinet. Without a body, there was no crime to solve. Yet the legend refused to die. Sightings of Coleman popped up from time to time. Someone claimed they saw him in Cincinnati. Another swore he was living under a different name in Kentucky. Each lead fizzled, disproven within days. But the stories kept circulating, fueling speculation that perhaps Coleman had chosen to disappear. That maybe, just maybe, he had grown tired of his solitary life and started over somewhere new. But not everyone believed that. Some insisted something terrible had happened inside Millhaven High. A few suggested he had been attacked by a student. Others whispered that a janitor or fellow teacher might have held a grudge. Without evidence, though, suspicion was only that. Suspicion. By the late 90s, Coleman's case had become the quintessential cold case, unsolved, unforgotten, yet seemingly unresolvable. Reporters occasionally mentioned him in lists of Ohio's unsolved disappearances. His faded photo, black suit, stern expression, glasses, appeared in anniversary articles. But even those mentions dwindled as time marched forward. Then came the year 2001. After nearly 3 decades, Millhaven High was due for renovations. The building was outdated, its wiring unsafe, its plaster walls crumbling. Contractors were hired to modernize the classrooms. Parents welcomed the change, eager to see the old high school brought back to life. No one could have imagined that the renovations would stir up the past in a way no one in Millhaven was prepared for. The cold case was about to come back, not because of new detectives or new witnesses, but because of a sledgehammer breaking open the walls of room 2B. In the summer of 2001, Millhaven High School buzzed with the sound of drills, hammers, and construction crews. After nearly 3 decades of patchwork fixes, the school board had finally approved a major renovation. The plan was to modernize the classrooms, replace outdated wiring, and tear down old plaster walls that had stood since the 1940s. On a warm morning in June, a team of contractors arrived to begin work in the West Wing, the oldest part of the building. One of their first assignments was Room 2B, the classroom where generations of students had whispered ghost stories about the missing teacher. To the workers, it was just another job. Remove the cracked plaster, update the electrical wiring, and rebuild the walls. But as they struck their hammers against the wall behind the blackboard, they uncovered something no one expected. At first, it looked like dust and debris spilling from the cavity. Then one worker's flashlight caught on something pale, something that wasn't wood or stone. A long, curved shape that didn't belong inside a school wall. He froze. "That's a bone," he whispered. The others laughed nervously, until another hammer blow widened the opening. More of the cavity came into view, and this time, there was no mistaking it. Inside the hollow space, half hidden in crumbling plaster, lay the unmistakable outline of a human skeleton. The workers stepped back in stunned silence. They weren't archaeologists. They weren't trained for this. All they knew was that a body was entombed inside the very wall of room 2B. Within the hour, the construction site was sealed off. Police swarmed the building, yellow tape stretched across the hallways, and students who had come for summer classes were sent home. For the first time in nearly 30 years, the disappearance of Richard Coleman was no longer a rumor. It was a crime scene. Detectives and forensic specialists worked methodically, cutting away the plaster inch by inch. The cavity revealed more than bones. The skeleton was slumped against the inner brickwork, as if someone had forced it into a seated position. Tattered remains of a brown suit still clung to the bones. On the skull, a pair of rusted, broken, horn-rimmed glasses clung to the sockets. Every detail pointed to one conclusion. This was Mr. Richard Coleman. Forensic experts carefully cataloged what remained. Around the bones lay fragments of cloth, scraps of paper, and an old leather belt. The belt wasn't around the waist. It was looped around the neck, pulled tight, its buckle frozen against the vertebrae. It was the first clear indication that Coleman had not simply disappeared. He had been killed. News of the discovery spread through Millhaven like wildfire. Former students called each other in shock. Retired teachers wept at the confirmation of what they had feared for years. Parents gathered outside the school, whispering about how their children had sat just feet away from a hidden grave. For decades, they had believed the walls held secrets. Now it was undeniable. The autopsy confirmed what the scene suggested. Coleman had died from strangulation. The position of the skeleton indicated he had been placed deliberately, hidden in the cavity before the wall was sealed shut. Whoever did it had time, access, and confidence that no one would ever look behind the plaster. The discovery reignited the investigation with a force that Millhaven had never seen. Detectives pulled Coleman's old file from storage, spreading the yellowed papers across new desks. They compared faded witness statements to the grim evidence now in front of them. For the first time, the town had proof. Richard Coleman hadn't run away. He hadn't started a new life. He had been murdered inside the very place where he taught. Theories resurfaced, now sharper, darker. Had it been a student, furious at his strict teaching style? A colleague with a hidden grudge? A janitor with keys and late-night access? The list of suspects seemed endless, but after nearly 30 years, many of those people were gone, retired, relocated, or deceased. What stunned investigators most was the audacity of the crime. To hide a body behind a wall inside a functioning classroom required planning. It required knowledge of the building's structure, and it required confidence that no one would notice the absence of a teacher long enough for the wall to be sealed. As forensic teams carried the remains out of Millhaven High under the glare of television cameras, the town was forced to confront a haunting truth. For decades, children had learned history while sitting only feet away from the body of their missing teacher. The legend of Room 2B was not a ghost story. It was real. What remained was the most difficult question of all. Who killed Richard Coleman, and why? The answers would take investigators deep into the tangled relationships of Millhaven's past, into jealous colleagues, troubled students, and the dark corners of a community that had kept its silence for far too long. The cold case was no longer cold. It had exploded back into life. The discovery of Richard Coleman's body in the wall of Room 2B shook Millhaven to its core. What had once been a local mystery, a ghost story, told in hushed tones, was now an undeniable truth. A man had been murdered and entombed inside a school where hundreds of children learned every year. The shock was immediate, but the demand for answers was louder. Who had killed Coleman, and how had they hidden his body so brazenly in a public building? Detectives faced a daunting challenge. Nearly 3 decades had passed since Coleman vanished. Witnesses had aged, memories had faded, and many of the original staff were gone. But the body behind the wall changed everything. It meant there had been foul play, and it meant there had always been a killer walking free in Millhaven. The investigation began with the basics. Police reopened interviews with anyone still alive who had worked at the school in 1974. Old teachers, janitors, even students who were now middle-aged adults were contacted. They were asked the same questions once posed long ago. What did you remember about that day? Who did Coleman speak with last? Did anyone hold a grudge against him? Slowly, fragments of truth began to surface. Several former students remembered that Coleman had been stricter than most teachers. He embarrassed students when they didn't know answers, demanded homework be perfect, and gave detentions easily. Some admired his discipline, others despised him for it. But one name kept coming up. Thomas Greer, a student who had been in Coleman's class the very year he disappeared. Greer had been 17 at the time. Known as a troublemaker, he often clashed with teachers, but his feud with Coleman was personal. Classmates recalled Coleman catching him cheating on a test and threatening to report him to the principal. Others remembered shouting matches in the hallway. Coleman, they said, had once told Greer, "You won't graduate if you don't change." To a teenager with a temper, those words cut deep. Detectives dug into Greer's life. They discovered that after high school, he stayed in Millhaven, working odd jobs. He became a custodian, briefly hired at the very same school where he once studied. Employment records confirmed it. In October 1974, Thomas Greer was working as a janitor at Millhaven High. He had keys to every classroom, knowledge of every wall and hallway. The theory began to take shape. Greer had access, motive, and opportunity. If Coleman had stayed late in room 2B, and if an argument escalated, Greer could have acted in a fit of rage. The belt found looped around the skeleton's neck could easily have belonged to a janitor's uniform. And after the act, Greer could have hidden the body in the cavity of the wall during ongoing repairs. Repairs that, investigators learned, had indeed been happening in that wing of the school in the mid-1970s. Still, theory wasn't proof. Detectives needed evidence. They turned to forensic science. Though decades had passed, the belt buckle and scraps of cloth were carefully tested. DNA swabs revealed trace genetic material that did not belong to Coleman. When compared to Greer, who was still alive and living quietly in a nearby county, the results matched. Armed with both circumstantial history and modern science, detectives moved in. In November 2001, Thomas Greer, now in his mid-40s, was arrested at his small home outside Millhaven. He was stunned, insisting he had nothing to do with Coleman's disappearance. But under questioning, cracks began to show. Investigators presented the evidence: the DNA on the belt, the employment records, the witness statements. Greer eventually broke. He confessed that on the night of October 14, 1974, he had confronted Coleman in room 2B. The argument escalated. Coleman threatened to report Greer again, this time for stealing supplies. Enraged, Greer attacked him with the belt from his own janitor's uniform. Coleman fought back, but was overpowered. Within minutes, he was dead. Panicked, Greer realized he had to hide the body. Construction crews had been working on the walls of the school that week, leaving cavities exposed. With keys and late-night access, he stuffed Coleman's body into the hollow behind the blackboard, sealed it with plaster, and cleaned the room. By the time anyone noticed Coleman was missing, the wall looked untouched. For nearly 30 years, the body remained hidden in plain sight. Students wrote essays, took exams, and daydreamed through lectures only feet away from a secret grave. Greer carried that knowledge with him every day, never speaking of it, convinced the truth would never surface. The trial was swift. The combination of Greer's confession, the DNA evidence, and the discovery of Coleman's remains led to a conviction of second-degree murder. The judge called it one of the most chilling cases of concealment the court has ever seen. Greer was sentenced to life in prison. For the town of Millhaven, the conviction brought a strange mix of relief and horror. On one hand, the mystery that haunted generations had finally been solved. On the other, the reality was almost worse than the legend. The killer hadn't been a stranger, nor had Coleman vanished mysteriously into the night. He had been murdered by one of his own students, hidden behind a wall in the very school where life carried on as normal. For former students, the revelation was surreal. Some remembered sitting in room 2B, staring at the blackboard, never realizing that their teacher was entombed just inches away. One woman, now in her 40s, said, "We told ghost stories for years. I can't believe we were right. He was really there." Richard Coleman was finally laid to rest in 2002, nearly 30 years after his disappearance. Former students, colleagues, and townspeople attended the service. They remembered him not as a ghost story, but as a man, strict, proud, flawed, but a teacher who had deserved better. The story of Millhaven became more than just a local tragedy. Documentaries, podcasts, and true crime enthusiasts picked it up, fascinated by the chilling detail that an entire community had lived with the truth hidden in a wall. For years to come, people would remember the case of the teacher who vanished, only to be found behind his own classroom blackboard. Justice had been delayed, but it had not been denied.